Science fiction and fantasy have been part of mainstream Russian literature since the 19th century. Russian fantasy developed from the centuries-old traditions of Slavic mythology and folklore. Russian science fiction emerged in the mid-19th century and rose to its golden age during the Soviet era, both in cinema and literature, with writers like the Strugatsky brothers, Kir Bulychov, and Mikhail Bulgakov, among others. With the fall of the Iron Curtain, modern Russia experienced a renaissance of fantasy. Outside modern Russian borders, there are a significant number of Russophone writers and filmmakers from Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan, who have made a notable contribution to the genre's terminology. In the Russian language, fantasy, science fiction, horror and all other related genres are considered a part of a larger umbrella term, roughly equivalent to speculative fiction, and are less divided than in the West. The Russian term for science fiction is, which can be literally translated as scientific fantasy. Since there was very little adult-oriented fantasy fiction in Soviet times, Russians did not use a specific term for this genre until perestroika. Although Russian language has a literal translation for fantasy, the word refers to a dream or imagination, not literary genre. Today, Russian publishers and literary critics use direct English transcription. Gothic and supernatural stories are often referred to as a term with no direct equivalent in the West. Imperial period, 18th and early 19th centuries. While science fiction did not emerge in Russia as a coherent genre until the early 20th century, many aspects thereof, such as utopia or imaginary voyage, are found in earlier Russian works. Fyodor Dmitriev Mamonov's A Philosopher Nobleman is considered prototypical to science fiction. It is a Voltairean conte philosophic influenced by micromegas. Utopia was a major genre of early Russian speculative fiction. The first generic utopia in Russian was a short story by Alexander Sumarikov, A Dream of Happy Society. Two early utopias in form of Imaginary Voyage of Vasily Levshin's Newest Voyage and Mikhail Shabatov's Journey to the Land of Ophir. Pseudo-historical heroic romances in classical settings by Fyodor Emin, Mikhail Gerashkov, Pavel Lvov and Pyotr Zakharyan were also utopian. Ancient Night of the Universe, an epic poem by Semen Bebrov, is the first work of Russian cosmism. Some of Fyodor Bulgarin's tales are set in the future, others exploited themes of Hollow Earth and spaceflight, as did Osip Senkovsky's Fantastic Voyages of Baron Brambius. Authors of Gothic stories included Alexander Bestujev with his German Kula Lokal, Sergei Lyubetsky, Vladimir Ulin, Alexei K. Tolstoy, Elizaveta Kologrivova and Mikhail Lermontov. By the mid-19th century, imaginary voyages to space had become popular chapbooks, such as Voyage to the Sun and Planet Mercury and All the Visible and Invisible Worlds by Dmitry Segal. Correspondence of a Moonman with an Earthman by Pyotr Mashkov. Voyage to the Moon in a Wonderful Machine by Semen Dyachkov and Voyage in the Sun by Demokrit Tupinovich. Popular literature used fantastic motifs like demons, invisibility and shrinking men. Hoffman's fantastic tales caused great impact on Russian writers including Nikolai Gogol, Antony Pogorelsky, Nikolai Melganov, Vladimir Kolgov, Nikolai Polovoy, Alexei Timofeyev, Konstantin Aksakov and Vasily Ushakov. Folklore supernatural tall tales are stylized by Orest Somov, Vladimir Ulan, Mikhail Zagoskin and Nikolai Bilovich. Vladimir Odowevsky, the Romantic writer influenced by Hoffman, wrote on his vision of the future and scientific progress. He was also an author of many Gothic tales. Alexander Veltman, along with his folk romances and Hoffmanesque satiric tales, in 1836 published Predki Kalamrosa, Alexander Filipovich Makedonsky, the first Russian novel to feature time travel. In the book, the main character rides to ancient Greece on a hippogriff to meet Aristotle and Alexander the Great. Year 3448. A Heliodoric love romance set in the future is also science fictional. There, a traveler visits an imaginary Balkan country, Bosphorania, and sees social and technological advances of the 35th century. Late 19th, early 20th century. The second half of the 19th century saw the rise of realism. However, fantasies with a scientific rationale by Nikolai Aksheromov and Nikolai Wagner stand out during this period, as well as Ivan Turgenev's mysterious tales and Vera Zhelehovsky's occult fiction. Mikhail Mikhailov's story, Beyond History, a pre-Darwinian fantasy on the descent of man, is an early example of prehistoric fiction. Fictional accounts of prehistoric men were written by anthropologists and popular science writers. Mikhail Saltykov-Shkedron's satires use a fantastic and grotesque element. The plot of Animal Mutiny by historian Nikolai Kostomarov is similar to that of Orwell's Animal Farm. Some of Fyodor Dostoevsky's short works also use fantasy. The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, a doppelganger novella The Double, a Petersburg poem, Mesmeric the Landlady, and a comic horror story Bobik. Dostoevsky's magazine Vremya was first to publish Russian translations of Edgar Allan Poe's stories in 1861. Prose of Alexander Kondratyev included the mythological novel Satyrus and collection of mythological stories White Goat, both based on Greek myths. Journeys and Adventures of Nicodemus the Elder by another symbolist Alexei Skaldin is a Gnostic fantasy. Utopias. Nikolai Chernyshevsky's influential What Is to Be Done included a utopian dream of the far future, which became a prototype for many socialist utopias. A noted example is the duology by Marxist philosopher and Lenin's adversary Alexander Bogdanov, Red Star and Engineer Many. Some plays of another Marxist, Anatoly Lunacharsky, propone his philosophical ideas in fantastic disguise. Other examples of socialist utopias include Diary of Andrei by pseudonymous A. Virginia Sky on Another Planet by Porfiry Infantiev, and Spring Feast by Nikolai Oliga. Alexander Kuprin wrote a short story of the same kind, Toast. Among others, Vladimir Solovyov wrote Tale of the Antichrist, an ecumenical utopia. Earthly Paradise by Konstantin Merezhkovsky is an anthropological utopia. Great War Between Men and Women by Sergei Solomon and Women Uprising and Defeated by Polish writer Ferdinand Antony Osandowski tell stories of a feminist revolution. Other feminist utopias include short farces Women on Mars by Victor Bilibin and Women Problem by Nadezhda Tefi. In Half a Century by Sergei Sharapov is a patriarchal slave-file utopia, and Land of Bliss by Crimean Tatar Ishmael Gasprinsky is a Muslim utopia. Voluminous A Created Legend by another symbolist Fyodor Sologub is a utopia full of science-fictional wonders close to magic. Genre fiction. Entertainment fiction adopted scientific themes, such as resurrection of an ancient Roman, global disaster, mind-dreading devices, Antarctic city-states, an elixir of longevity, and Atlantis. Spaceflight remained a central science fiction topic since the 1890s in the Ocean of Stars by Anony Leike, In the Moon and Dreams of Earth and Skies by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, Voyage to Mars by Leonid Bogomolensky, In Space by Nikolai Morozov, Sailing Ether by Boris Krasnogorsky and its sequel, Islands of Ethereal Ocean. In the 1910s, Russian audiences grew interested in horror. Fire Blossom, a supernatural thriller by Alexander Amphityatrov and Vera Križanovsky's occult romances, that combined science fiction and reactionary elitist utopia, were popular. Bram Stoker's Dracula was imitated by pseudonymous B. Olshevri in Vampires, even before the original was translated to Russian. Early Alexander Grin's stories are mostly psychological horror, though later he drifted to more literary kinds of fantasy. Future progress was described in fiction by scientists. Wonders of Electricity by electric engineer Vladimir Shiklif, Automatic Underground Railway by Alexander Rodnik, and Billionaire's Testament by biologist Porfiry Bakhmatyev. Future war stories were produced by the military and Fatal War of 18, by retired Navy officer Alexander Bellamore. Big Fist, a Chinese-European war by K. Golikova-Stov, Queen of the World and Kings of the Air by Navy officer Vladimir Semenov. War of Nations 1921–1923 by X. War of the Ring with the Union by Prtsky, and End of War by Lev Shanov. Threat to the World by Ivan Ryapasov is like Jules Verne's The Begum's Fortune, but the villain is an Englishman. Jules Verne was so widely read that Anton Chekhov wrote a parody on him, and Konstantin Sluchevsky produced a sequel, Captain Nemo in Russia. Soviet period. Soviet science fiction. The Soviet era was the golden age of Russian science fiction. Soviet writers were innovative, numerous and prolific, despite limitations set up by state censorship. Both Russian and foreign writers of science fiction enjoyed mainstream popularity in the Soviet Union, and many books were adapted for film and animation. Early Soviet era. The birth of Soviet science fiction was spurred by scientific revolution, industrialization, mass education and other dramatic social changes that followed the Russian Revolution. Early Soviet authors from the 1920s, such as Alexander Belyaev, Grigory Adamov, Vladimir Obrushev and Alexei N. Tolstoy, stacked a hard science fiction. They openly embraced influence from the genre's Western classics, such as Jules Verne, Arthur Conan Doyle and especially H. G. Wells, who was a socialist and sympathizer of Soviet Russia. Science fiction books from 1920s included science predictions, adventure and space travel, often with a hue of working-class agenda and satire against capitalism. Alexei N. Tolstoy's Elita, one of the most influential books of the era, featured two Russians raising a revolution on Mars. Tolstoy's Engineer Garin's Death Ray follows a mad scientist who plans to take over the world, and he's eventually welcomed by capitalists. Similarly, the main antagonist of Belyev's The Air Seller is a megalomaniac capitalist who plots to steal all the world's atmosphere. Belyev's Battle in Ether is about a future world war, fought between communist Europe and capitalist America. Soviet authors were also interested in the distant past. Belyaev described his view of historical Atlantis in The Last Man from Atlantis, and Obrushev is best known for Plutonia, set inside Hollow Earth where dinosaurs and other extinct species survived, as well as for his other Lost World novel, Sannikov Land. Two notable exclusions from Soviet Wellsian tradition were Yevgeny Zamyatin, author of dystopian novel We, and Mikhail Bulgakov, who contributed to science fiction with Heart of a Dog, The Fatal Eggs and Ivan Vasilievich. The two used science fiction for social satire rather than scientific prediction and challenged the traditional communist worldview. Some of the books were refused or even banned and only became officially published in the 1980s. Nevertheless, Zamyatin and especially Bulgakov became relatively well known through circulation of fan-made copies. The following Stalin era, from the mid-1930s to the early 1950s, saw a period of stagnation stagnation in Soviet science fiction, because of heavy censorship that forced the writers to adopt socialist realism cliches. Science fiction of this period is called close aim. Instead of the distant future, it was set in tomorrow and limited itself to anticipation of industrial achievements, inventions and travels within the solar system. The top close aim writers were Alexander Kazantsev, Georgy Martynov, Vladimir Savchenko and Georgy Gurevich. In films, the close aim era lasted longer, and many films based on close aim books and scripts were made in the 1950s and 1960s. Some of these films, namely Planet of the Storms and The Sky Beckons, were pirated, re-edited and released in the West under different titles. Late Soviet era. In the second half of the 20th century, Soviet science fiction authors, inspired by the thaw period of the 1950s and 1960s and the country's space pioneering, developed a more varied and complex approach. The liberties of the genre offered Soviet writers a loophole for free expression. Social science fiction, concerned with philosophy, ethics, utopian and dystopian ideas, became the prevalent subgenre. Most Soviet writers still portrayed the future Earth optimistically as a communist utopia. Some did it frankly, some to please publishers and avoid censorship. Post-apocalyptic and dystopian plots were usually placed outside Earth, on underdeveloped planets, in the distant past, or on parallel worlds. Nevertheless, the settings occasionally bore illusion of the real world, and could serve as a satire of contemporary society. The breakthrough is considered to have been started with Ivan Yefremov's Andromeda, a utopia set in the very distant future. Yefremov rose to fame with his utopian views on the future, as well as on ancient Greece in his historical novels. He was soon followed by a duo of brothers Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, who have taken a more critical approach. The books included darker themes and social satire. The Strugatskys are best known for the Noon Universe novels, such as Hard to Be a God and Prisoners of Power. A recurring theme in Strugatsky's fiction were progressives, agents of utopian future Earth who secretly spread scientific and social progress to underdeveloped planets. Progressives often failed, bitterly recognizing that society is not ready for communism. The brothers are also credited for the Soviets' first science fantasy, The Monday Begins on Saturday trilogy, and the post-apocalyptic novel Roadside Picnic is often believed to have been a prediction of the Chernobyl disaster. Another notable late Soviet writer was Kir Bulychov, whose books featured time travel and parallel worlds, and themes like anti-militarism and environment protection. The space opera subgenre was less developed, because both state censors and highbrow intelligentsia writers viewed it unfavorably. Nevertheless, there were moderately successful attempts to adapt space westerns to Soviet soil. The first was Alexander Kolpakov with Griada, followed by Sergei Snigov with The Humans as Gods trilogy, among others. A specific branch of both science fiction and children's books appeared in the mid-Soviet era, the children's science fiction. It was meant to educate children while entertaining them. The star of the genre was Bulychov, who, along with his adult books, created Eliza Selezneva, a children's space adventure series about a teenage girl from the future. Others include Nikolai Nosov with his books about dwarf Nezhnika, Evgeny Veltistov, who wrote about Robot Boy Electronic, Vitaly Melentiev, Jan Larry, Vladislav Krapivin, and Vitaly Gubarev. Films and other media. Soviet cinema developed a tradition of science fiction films, with directors like Pavel Klashantsev, Andrei Tarkovsky, Konstantin Lopushansky, Vladimir Tarasov, Richard Viktorov and Gennady Tishenko. Many science fiction books, especially children's, were made into films, animation and TV. The most adapted Russian SF author was Bulychov. Of the numerous films based on Eliza Seleznyeva stories, Animation Mystery of the Third Planet is probably the most popular. Other Bulychov-based films include Per Aspera ad Astra, Guest from the Future, Two Tickets to India, The Pass and the Witch's Cave. Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker was written by the Strugatskys, and is loosely based on The Roadside Picnic. There were also less successful films based on Dead Mountaineers Hotel and Hard to Be a God. Aelita was the first Soviet SF film, and Engineer Garin was made into film twice, in 1965 and in 1973. Amphibian Man, The Andromeda Nebula, Ivan Vasilievich, Heart of a Dog, Sanikov's Land and Electronic were filmed as well. There were also numerous adaptations of foreign science fiction books, most frequently by Jules Verne, Stanislaw Lem and Ray Bradbury. Of the movies based on original scripts, the comedy Kindy ZA and children's space opera duology Moscow Cassiopeia and Teens in the Universe should be noted. Despite the genre's popularity, the Soviet Union had very few media dedicated solely to science fiction, and most of them were fanzines, released by SF fan clubs. SF short stories were usually present in either popular science magazines, such as Technika Molodezhi, Vokrugs Veteran Uralsky Sledopit, or in literary anthologies, such as Mir Prickly Argeni, that also included adventure, history and mystery. Soviet fantasy literature. Fantasy fiction in the Soviet Union was represented primarily by children's tales and stage plays. Some of the early Soviet children's prose was loose adaptations of foreign fairy tales unknown in contemporary Russia. Alexei N. Tolstoy wrote Buratino, a light-hearted and shortened adaptation of Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio. Alexander Volkov introduced fantasy fiction to Soviet children with his loose translation of Frank L. Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, published as The Wizard of the Emerald City, and then wrote a series of 5 sequels, unrelated to Baum. Another notable author was Lazarlagan with Old Kotabij, a children's tale about an Arab genie Kotabij bound to serve a Soviet schoolboy. Any sort of literature that dealt seriously with the supernatural, either horror, adult-oriented fantasy or magic realism, was unwelcomed by Soviet censors. Until the 1980s, very few books in these genres were written, and even fewer were published, although earlier books, such as Spy Gogol, were not banned. Of the rare exceptions, Bulgakov in Master and Margarita, the Strugatskys in Monday Begins on Saturday, and Vladimir Orlov in Altus Danilov introduced magic and mystical creatures into contemporary Soviet reality in a satirical and fabulous manner. Another exception was early Soviet writer Alexander Grin, who wrote romantic tales, both realistic and fantastic. Magic and other fantasy themes occasionally appeared in theatrical plays by Evgeny Shvarts, Grigory Gorin and Mikhail Bulgakov. The plays were family-oriented fables, where supernatural elements served as an allegory. The supernatural horror genre, by contrast, was almost completely eliminated by censors' demands for every media to be modest and family-friendly. Films, fantasy, mythology and folklore were often present in Soviet film and animation, especially children's. Most films were adaptations of traditional fairy tales and myths, both Russian and foreign, but there were also many adaptations of stories by Alexander Pushkin, Nikolai Gogol, Rudyard Kipling, Astrid Lindgren, Alan Alexander Milne, among many others. There were numerous fantasy feature films by Alexander Rue and Alexander Tushko. Fantasy animated features were produced by directors like Lev Atmanov, Ivan Ivanov Vano, and Alexandra Snezko-Blotskaya. The late Soviet era saw a number of adult-oriented fabulous films, close to magic realism. They were written by Shortskorin and Strugatsky. Most of them were directed by Mark Zakharov. Several Soviet fantasy films were co-produced with foreign studios. Most notably, Mio in the Land of Far Away was shot by a Soviet crew in English language, and featured Christopher Lee and Christian Bale. Other examples include The Story of Voyages and Sampo. Most notable Soviet writers. Post-Soviet period literature from the 1990s to this day, fantasy and science fiction are among the best-selling literature in Russia. The fall of state censorship in the late 1980s allowed publishing of numerous translations of Western books and films that were previously unreleased in Russia. A new wave of writers rediscovered high fantasy and was influenced with John R. Tolkien, Robert E. Howard, and, more recently, George R. Martin. As a result, the popularity of traditional hard science fiction relatively faded, and fantasy, with distinctive Western features, became the predominant genre. While the majority of fantasy writers, such as Nick Perumov, Vera Kamsha, Alexei Pekov and Tony Vygotsky, follow the Western tradition with its archetypal Norse or Anglo-Saxon settings, some others, most notably Maria Semenova and Yuri Nikitin, prefer Russian mythology as inspiration. Comic fantasy is also popular, with authors such as Max Frei, Andrei Belinin and Olga Gromyko. Urban and Gothic fantasy, virtually absent in the Soviet Union, became mainstream in modern Russia after the success of Sergei Lukyanenko's Night Watch and Vadim Panov's Secret City. Magic realism is represented by Maria Galina and Lyudmila Petrushevskaya. Sergei Malitsky is also a notable author with his own distinctive style. In science fiction, with communist censorship gone, many various portrayals of the future appeared, including dystopias, post-apocalyptic fiction, time travel and alternate history are among the most popular genres, represented by authors like Vyacheslav Rybakov, Yuri Nikitin and Yulia Latinina among many others. Overuse of fish-out-of-water plots for time travel and parallel worlds led Russian SF and AMP-F journalists to coin the ironic slur "popadonets" for such characters. There are still many writers of traditional space-related science fiction, including space operas, such as Alexander Zorich, Lukyanenko and Andrei Livadny, among others. The late 2000s and early 2010s saw a rise of Russian steampunk, with such books as Alexei Pekov's Mockingbird, Vadim Panov's Hermeticon, and Cetopolis by Gray F. Green. A large part of modern Russian SF and AMP-F is written in Ukraine, especially in its sci-fi capital, Kharkiv, home to H.L. Oldie, Alexander Zorich, Yuri Nikitin and Andrei Valentinov. Many others hail from Kiev, including Marina and Sergei Dyachenko and Vladimir Aronev. Belarusian authors, such as Olga Gromyko, Kirill Benediktov, Yuri Breda and Nikolai Chadovich, also contributed to the genres. Some authors, namely Kamsha, Dyachenkos and Frei, were born in Ukraine and moved to Russia at some point. Most Ukrainian and Belarusian SF and AMP-F authors write in Russian, which gives them access to a broad Russophone audience of the post-Soviet countries, and usually publish the books via Russian publishers such as Exmo Azbuka and AST. In the post-Soviet fantasy and science fiction, the extensive serializing of successful formulas has become usual. Most notable are the two post-apocalyptic book series based on the STALK computer game and Metro 2033 novel, both of which featured a well-developed universe. The STALK book series features a heavy branding and almost negligible influence of the actual writer's name on individual novels. and though Metro 2033 raised its creator Dmitry Glukhovsky to national fame, it quickly developed into a franchise, with over 15 books published by various authors and spanned a tie-in video game, other media production of science fiction films and fantasy films in modern Russia dropped in comparison to the Soviet cinema, due to high costs of visual effects. Throughout the 1990s, almost no movies in this genre were made. In the 2000s and 2010s, however, Russia once again produced a number of films. Most of them were based on books, notably by Sergei Lukyanenko, Bulychov, the Strugatskys, Semenova and Gogol. A number of children's fairy tale films and animations were based on Russian mythology and history, most of them by Melnitsa Animation Studio. In 2014, the Soviet classic Kindy Zday was remade into a family-friendly animation coup, Kindy Zday. Very few films based on original scripts were made, notable exceptions being mockumentary First on the Moon, time travel drama We Are From the Future, superhero film Black Lightning and the neo-noir superhero film Zashitniki. Russian video game developers also contributed to the genres. Examples include fantasy-based MMORPG Aladdin's Online, turn-based strategy Ethlords and science fiction RTS Perimeter, among many others. SF and AMP-F magazines, websites and other media became widespread in modern Russia. The largest magazine is Mir Fantastiki, while ESLI and Polden 21 Vek have closed down after the Great Recession. Ukrainian magazines, such as RBG Azimuth or Rianost Fantastiki, are mostly Russophone. Among websites, FantLab.ru and Mer.ru are considered the most influential, according to Roskin Award. Notable writers